Good afternoon, everyone, on this beautiful Tuesday afternoon. Another election day in Israel. Elections being held for the fourth time in 2 years. Israelis of all stripes and types are casting their ballot to decide yet again who will be the prime minister. So far, an election the polls only closed at 4 p.m. in Israel, our time, which is 10 p.m. in Israel. Turnout is very low. People are sick of elections already and feel like there is no solution. And every time there's another election and they're frustrated, and depending on which side you're on, you have something negative to say about constant elections. But the truth is that with all its challenges and struggles, there's something to celebrate about Israel's democracy. And that, yes, even if there has to be elections 4 times in 2 years, they're run in a way that are open, that are free, that are fair. And the way the Knesset runs, that although it's not like America with a 2-party system, but there are very small parties which allow people to focus on what they really want and not have to vote for a party just because there's only 2, and this is where some of their things and some of their opinions are. But I was thinking about this, talking about democracy, talking about freedom. The Passover Seder, Saturday night, we're all going to sit down at the Seder, we're going to recline, and we're going to start singing Kadesh Urchatz, and we're going to celebrate this beautiful sense of freedom. We're going to be there with our families, looking at each other and celebrating the gift of freedom that the Jewish people have had. And one of the biggest questions always asked is, what does it mean that we celebrate freedom? How could it be that Jews have celebrated freedom and Passover Seder at the most oppressive times ever? During the Holocaust, in the camps, Jews risked their lives to celebrate Passover. During the Crusades, during the Cossacks, during thousands of years of suffering, no matter where we've been in Israel or diaspora, free or enslaved, we've celebrated freedom. And even if we were in a place that was oppressive, we tried to imagine, to celebrate and to recline, and to envision the freedom that is so dear to all of us. Even this past year, when we were in the midst of the beginning of the terrible pandemic and people were so alone, so afraid, so many people did the Seder on their own for the first time in their lives, yet we still celebrated this idea of freedom. But how could we be celebrating freedom under such conditions? In fact, my mother always told me, I'm not sure if I told you, but my grandfather, who my son Moshe, whose birthday is tonight, is named for, was a teacher in an underground yeshiva that the Lubavitcher Rebbe set up in Russia after communism outlawed Jewish study. And my grandfather, as a young man, risked his life to teach in the yeshiva, and he was thrown into prison because he was caught in this underground yeshiva, and instead of blaming the parents for sending their kids, he took responsibility. And my grandfather spent Passover in prison, in the Gulag, and trust me, it made Rikers Island in New York look like a palace, like a paradise. And on Passover, what did my grandfather do? He didn't have matzah. He didn't have maror. So he traded the little pieces of bread he would get with some of the other prisoners for their cube of sugar. And he took 3 cubes of sugar and he piled them one on top of the other as if they were his matzah. And he said to my mother, doesn't remember, she was 2 when he passed away, but to his wife later, that he used the tears as maror. And that's how he celebrated in the hardest conditions, but he yet celebrated Passover. And the Maral, the famous Kabbalist, the Maral of Prague, tells us that the reason why we celebrate freedom, even in the most oppressive times, is because what are we celebrating on Passover? Passover is not just a physical exodus from Egypt, but it's an existential paradigm shift that God gave the Jewish people, which He imbued within our souls our spiritual DNAs, the gift, the yearning, the fighting for freedom, always and everywhere. Wherever Jews have been throughout our history, no matter how oppressive it has been, for us or others, we always stood for a beacon of freedom, a beacon of light, for the idea that every single human being is endowed with this gift of freedom from the Almighty. What differentiates us from animals is our ability to choose to be free. And that's been at the core of who the Jewish people are. And that's why the Torah tells us every generation, and the Alter Rebbe and Tanya, the founder of the Chabad movement, in his magnum in his Tanya that he writes, he says that every single day we have to feel as if we went out of Egypt, because that gift of freedom that's inherent in every Jew is something that's a gift from God with the exodus of Egypt. You know, they say this story about this kid who was with his father in the camps, and they were trying to celebrate Passover, and his father asked him to say the Manishtana, and he said the Manishtana, and when they were finished saying the Manishtana, he looked at his father, he says, "Daddy, where are we going to be next year? Are we going to be able to say the Manishtana?" And the father looked at his son with tears in his eyes and said to him, "I don't know where or if we will be around next year. But one thing I could promise you and guarantee you, that somewhere in the world, wherever it may be, there will be a child who will be asking his father the four questions." Think about it. 3,300 and some odd years since Moses took the Jews out of Egypt. And somewhere in the world, no matter where, or actually in all four corners of the world, there are children turning to their Father in heaven and asking the four questions. Why is this night different than all other nights? Why is this exile darker than all other exiles for the Jewish people? And somewhere out there we're crying for freedom. We're yearning for the ability to be free. But what does true freedom mean? The Talmud says, "In lecha ben chorin ela misha osek b'Torah." There is no true free person, only someone who delves into the Torah, who keeps the Torah, who cherishes the commandments and the wisdom that God has given us. And that's what we do when we sit down by the Seder. And although sometimes we might not feel so free, or we might feel constrained, we sit down with our families and we celebrate that gift of freedom that God has instilled within our souls. And we celebrate the Torah that He has given us and the commandments, and we nurture it and we embrace it, because the true freedom that was instilled within every Jew that God gave us when we left Egypt is in the Torah, is in the commandments, is in embracing our faith and our heritage and our tradition, not running away from it, not making new faiths, not making new traditions, but keeping those gifts that God gave us, having a Seder plate with the 6 items that has been done for 3,000 years, having a Haggadah that has been chanted for thousands of years. That tradition within it lies and has instilled our freedom. And as my mother always reminds me, that story of my grandfather, who in prison felt so free because he was able to celebrate in his mind and in his heart and in his yearning those traditions that we had. Remember what that father told his son in Auschwitz. Somewhere in the world, someone will be chanting the 4 questions again. And hopefully this year we will all be chanting the 4 questions in the Haggadah, as is in our tradition, and eating matzah and the maror and the 4 cups of wine, and celebrating that gift, that identity, that DNA of freedom, of yearning to be connected to God. God bless you. Have a good day.